we're back on the 0 hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And once again, I look forward to speaking with Richard Wolff. You know Richard Wolff's work, I suspect by now. Richard Wolff is an economist. He's an economic historian. He is the founder of Democracy at Work. His latest book is The Sickness is the System. He is also the host of Economic Update Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at the New York University. So first of all, Richard Wolff, as always, welcome to the program.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad to be here.
Secondly, of all the possible topics we could talk about, I saw the other day that you were censored by Facebook, or more specifically, that you wanted to post on Facebook an article about the strike at Hunts Point Market against Amazon. So, of course, I'm compelled to say, I want to talk about that story they censored. I want to give that story as much attention as possible, number one, or number two. But number one, I would also like to ask how that happened, even transpired. How did you become aware you'd been censored by the Leviathan?
Well, it turned out that several news outlets noticed it and called us. That's actually how we found out about it. If I understand from my staff, the folks that work with me, Facebook did not allow people to send it on. In other words, they could not share the story. We also put the story I did, the commentary on that strike, on Twitter. It hadn't the slightest problem. They were free with it. So it did get out to most of our audience. So for us, it was a minor interference. It was striking to us because, at least in our knowledge, this had never happened before, number one. And number two, nothing that I said in that commentary was in any way, shape, or form more critical, more radical, more whatever the words are that I could choose here than many, many other things that Facebook has not found at all objectionable, which is why this has never happened to us before. So it is hard to escape the inference that it was because of Amazon's upset, I guess, that this was done. Otherwise, very hard to explain what's going on or why they would do this. One of them, the news agencies that called us had a theory, and they asked us about it. Is this because of the more general defensiveness of Facebook about its political openness to the kinds of right wingers who produced the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and so the overzealous censor is censoring everything, right, left, and whatever that maybe strikes them. And that's as good a theory as any. I don't know whether that is true or not, but it was bizarre, and it was, one of those reminders which seemed to me Facebook would want to avoid, that we are in a world in which a private, profit-driven enterprise is in a position to shape public discourse, which has to be, in a society that takes free speech seriously, a matter of no small concern.
I couldn't agree more. And not only have I experienced related things, but I'm hearing these stories more and more. I was locked out of my own Twitter account for 8 months. never got an explanation, wrote countless people from the general counsel to, the political director here in Washington, D.C., never got an answer. Finally, at someone's suggestion, I wrote to their chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and copied my member of Congress. And within 45 minutes, my account was back after 8 months, but never got an explanation what had happened. I'm hearing more people, YouTube accounts that are, their source of income, the income is cut off, Twitter accounts shut off. So I'm seeing more of what you described, which is the kind of behavior that if it were coming from a government, our culture would never tolerate, is largely being passively accepted, it seems to me, by the population and enthusiastically embraced by large percentages of the Democratic liberal constituency as exactly what we ought to be doing. But to me, George Orwell's failure of imagination was to assume, if anything, and I'm not knocking George Orwell per se, but was failing to anticipate that the quote unquote Orwellian realities of the future could come from corporations and not just from what he imagined as the Soviet style government. That's my thought, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, what I see is a variation, I think, of what you're saying, which is that given the last 75 years of endless repetition of the following sort, the government is bad, the private sector is good. The government is the problem, the private sector is the preferable solution to that problem. We did that, as we all know, as a business pushback against the intrusion of the government in the 1930s and in World War II, when the government took an enormous role in the economy to save capitalism, basically from itself, but nonetheless it did. And the business community was frightened and wanted to shut that down, to cut that back, to undo the New Deal in favor of an economic system in which the government could not threaten them. Capitalists have always understood, much better than the mass of people, that once you have a society in which there is a politics of universal suffrage, in which most or all of the adult population is in a position to vote, you've got a problem, because the owners and operators of business, the individual businessman or woman, the board of directors of a corporation, these are tiny minorities of the people. The vast majority of us are employees, not employers. And we, as the majority in a universal suffrage system, are always, at least potentially, able to use the fact that we are the majority in politics to undo the results of the capitalist system in economics, whether it be by a progressive tax system, whether it be by 100 other conceivable measures. We have the majority to decide politically whether or not we're satisfied with the outcomes of an economic system over which a very small, unelected, and unaccountable minority preside. That means that the government has to be kept at bay. And the way that's been done in this country, very effectively, I might add, is by a program since 1945 of active demonization of the government. And you could see where that ends up on January 6th at the Capitol, where all kinds of people with all kinds of grievances, mostly about economic problems that they face, thought it was reasonable to go attack a government building, even though the one who fired them from their job is a private capitalist, the one who dispossessed them from their home is a private capitalist, and on and on and on. All right. Given all of that, the government can't do, as you rightly say, the government can't do things because it is already in everybody's eye a danger, a threat, an evil, you name it. Who can do it? Well, the other side of the coin, the private sector. So now the government can become complicit in doing things it itself can't do by rerouting the behavior through the private sector. The place you see it best is military. The bulk of the military work in places like Afghanistan and Iraq was done by private entities. You know, the Betsy DeVos's brother,
Right.
Mr. Prince, and folks like that. So you could get the government could avoid being pinned for cruelty, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity by having it done instead by a private company, which isn't so vulnerable to the press, which doesn't have to allow reporters everywhere where they want to go, which isn't going to be under the gun critically. And I think what you're seeing now is that domestic censorship can also be handled by a private army, but not the kind that wears fatigue outfits, but the kind that wears ties and jackets and operates social media.
Well, Richard Wolff, that answer, which is very cogent, brought a couple of things to mind, including what the political scientist Sheldon Wolin called the inverted totalitarianism, the idea that, the way to, and I'm going to, do violence, I'm afraid, to Mr. Wolin's thinking by oversimplifying for radio purposes, but the idea that, sometimes the best way to maintain control in a society like ours is with the illusion of democratic choice that's restrictive and kept very limited. And therefore, it's really almost like a kind of totalitarianism from below, because you can always say you chose this. And now on top of that, we're adding to the totalitarianism this private sector. Well, you don't have to go to Facebook if you don't want to, when in fact you do have to go to Facebook, because that's where, and Twitter and so on, because that's where all the interactions and information sharing is taking place. And therefore, as you say, the mercenary private sector can do things that would be totally unacceptable in most people's eyes for the government to do, to censor you and not give you any explanation ever, not have any recourse, not have any court to go to, and I guess that raises the question, assuming you agree with, that processing of what you had to say, more or less, that raises a question about what do we do? I mean, I wrote a piece back in 2014 for Salon suggesting that these companies be regulated as public utilities. Now I think that's too moderate a solution. I think even Ted Cruz has more radical ideas than that for what to do. But what exactly do we do? We've given these companies so much massive power. Should we nationalize them, or do you see a solution there?
Well, I think that there are some models in other parts of the world that ought to be followed in this way. And I would like to start it by talking about a problem in our political situation, which, if it were solved, would then solve this question too. We have a winner-take-all basic political system. If you get 51% of the vote, you are the representative of all the people there, including the 49% who voted against you and for something else. The Europeans don't do that. The Europeans have something called proportional representation. If you're a political party that gets 10% of the vote, then you get 10% of the seats in the parliament. In other words, the 10% of the people in your country that want you will now have a voice in debating and deciding the laws, the policies, and so on, which seems to me the essence of what democracy means. There is no need to exclude the voice of the others. The 10%, people who get 10% of the vote ought to get 10% of the influence and the decision making. It has worked in Europe. It is popular in Europe. No significant politician that I'm aware of in any European country opposes this or wants to go to the American system. Not at all, even though there's a sizable part of the American population which, when you ask them and explain the situation, would prefer a proportional representation. And we still have it. Some of the states run their primaries within the Republican and Democratic Party, as we well know, on a proportional system. In the last tour in 2020, for example, there were places where Joe Biden got X% of the Democratic primary vote, Bernie Sanders got Y%, and Bernie got a proportional number of delegates to the Democratic convention, and Biden got his proportion. Nobody thought that was un-American, unnecessary, or inappropriate. It is something we do. Why it applies inside the primary and not outside is one of the great mysteries for which we will need magicians to come up with an answer, because no reasonable person could. Okay, let's suppose we had proportional representation. The way it works in most European countries is you get seats in parliament if you get at least, and then there's a cutoff, 3%, 5%. There's some minimum you have to get. In other words, you can't have a party that has 11 people who tend to be your cousins voting for you, and then you get one person in parliament. It doesn't work. Right, there's a cutoff, there's a minimum. But this solves a number of problems. It says to people, if you want to be serious politically, you've got to get together with others and get at least 5%. That's the typical amount. But it also solves this other problem. If you go to France, which I do because part of my family is French, if you go to France and you have a television and it's Sunday morning, you watch programs on television that are a little bit like those we have here, Meet the Press and then all of those different kind of news programs. And there you will see something you never see in the United States. One week it'll be the conservatives. The next week it'll be the Labor Party. The next week it'll be the Socialist Party. The next week it'll be the Communist Party. Why? Because those parties get 5% or more of the vote, and therefore the requirement of balance that applies to their public address systems, their public radio and television, and it could apply to social media, is that you have to be balanced. You cannot give hours and hours and hours of exposure to Republicans and Democrats, but exclude socialists or nationalists or others to the extent that they have demonstrated through a proportional representation system that they speak for at least 5% of the people, and therefore are a part of the public conversation. I remember many years ago sitting in the living room of my relative's home in Paris, turning on the television Sunday morning and being blown away as the announcer explains, today we're interviewing such and such, the head of the Communist Party of France, who was able to then answer questions, was perfectly reasonable, explaining what the position, what the point of view of the communists was. And at the end of the program, the announcer said, next week, we're having Mr. Le Pen, who was the other side of the politics, the extreme right wing, and he would be there answering pretty comparable questions. I thought this was wonderful. I was hearing things I could never, ever hear in the United States. And I can assure you, the next morning, the buildings of Paris had not fallen down. There was no trouble in the street. The pastry tasted just as good as it did the day before. This is a society that has allowed a much broader range of public discourse than we have in the country, and is none the worse, and in my view, much the better for doing so.
As opposed to Richard Wolff, I remember being told in 1914, this was before Bernie declared for president, and I went to work for him, being lectured to at a conference in 2014 that the Democratic nominee was going to be Hillary Clinton, and I better get on board. And I remember saying, I won't vote for Hillary Clinton. And I was told, you're being irresponsible. And I said, well, I'm giving you 2 years notice. I don't know how much more responsible I could be than that. You have plenty of time to accommodate me. But it seems to me, with this binary system we have, this duopoly, political duopoly, you're also excoriated for being irresponsible if you have views that fall outside that. And this perhaps is why labor is struggling to get a foothold to get some of the political concessions it needs, I would think. Now the Democrats and Joe Biden say they want to support the PRO Act, which will assist organizing a little bit, but we don't have a labor party in the United States. And I guess that gets me to, if I may, this story that you were not permitted to share or comment about on Facebook, which itself is about our digital, overlords, for lack of a better term. And that is, it was about a strike against Amazon, as I recall, successful strike, right?
Yeah. Look, Amazon is in a very, very serious circumstance right now. It may not want to think so, but I think it's deluding itself. It is opposed in a very profound way across Europe, and the Americans are not hearing much about it, but there are major movements and hostilities from the labor movement, from the general population, from the political circles against Amazon for a whole host of reasons. There are now very serious labor movement efforts to organize. The working conditions in Amazon warehouses are legendary. There have been enough exposés and enough firsthand accounts that we know that that's true, and that the public relations of Amazon to pretend it isn't working very well. There is hostility from lots of businesses who are being treated by Amazon in ways they are not happy about, and they're making sure to get their stories into the media. Amazon has its problems, and given that I'm sympathetic to organized labor and to the labor movement, and always have been, I'm sympathetic to efforts to unionize, because I believe that workers have a better shot at a decent life if they bargain collectively than if they don't. Amazon has gone out of its way for years to keep unions away, to keep unions out, to defeat unions using tactics of all kinds, some of which are reasonable and some of which are not. And it is perfectly reasonable for me as a critic to talk about struggles of working people to mobilize, to form unions, to bargain collectively with Amazon. There's absolutely nothing in my doing that isn't 100% legal, 100% appropriate to the American political scene. And it has been ever since unions were legalized 100 years ago. So this is strange for Facebook or any institution, it doesn't have to be just them, to attempt to somehow limit or silence me in doing this. Had I called for anything bizarre, anything like the attack on the Capitol or anything, and I didn't. I don't believe in that stuff. I didn't do it then. I didn't do it with this case. I have never done, that's why I've never had a problem like this before. And I'm a bit mystified, given that I haven't changed my tone or the content of what I do. And I've been, I've been on Facebook for years and years and years. So this is all a worrisome notion that some policy adopted at some high level of Facebook then filters down to whoever the person is in the anonymous room somewhere, who decides suddenly that what has been perfectly okay is suddenly unokay. This is the very thing that people who are critical of censorship, that's the kind of stereotype of what should not be allowed to happen.
And sometimes I believe these things happen somewhat randomly. But even then, they don't owe you an explanation. And this program has found, and this is a classic case, for example, with YouTube, that if we do an episode on the dangers of fascism, that it gets censored because the word fascism is in it. That this censorship system can't distinguish between opposing something and supporting something. So it creates a kind of, talk about false consciousness. It creates a world in which certain phenomena don't even exist. And we don't know sometimes when it's being hidden from us. It's terrifying to me. And I guess I can't imagine why your very reasonable post was censored, but do you agree with those of us who think that some sort of nationalization or public utility arrangement or so, that we need a radically new approach to these digital media, or do you have a position on that?
Yeah, I'm in favor of it, but I do know that there are already fairness doctrines that have been adopted either as law or as regulations or a mixture of both by the various, Federal Communications Commission and others that are charged with a certain amount of this oversight. And my suspicion is something has to be done to make this work. We may not need more regulations and laws. We may just need the proper execution of them, the proper application of these kinds of controls. But I would like to comment, because I think it's really important what you said or what you alluded to a few moments ago about being afraid of the history of things being not discussed that the public needs. We need to think and talk about fascism, either because we love it and want to pursue it, which I assume some do, or we hate it and want to prevent it, which at least I do. But I know that part of that, if I'm going to succeed, then people need to know what it is and where it came from. And let me give you an example of this, of an amnesia that happens. After World War II in 1945, as you and I know, RJ, because we weren't adults, but we were young at the time, and we've heard these stories. There was a radical change in the United States. During the 1930s and through World War II, socialists and communists were able to function in the United States as political parties, as individuals, as activists. The United States was allied with the Soviet Union in World War II. At the end of the war, the fear of the business community about the power of socialists and communists, about what the Soviets' success in World War II might mean, and perhaps mostly that they had been made to pay very high taxes to fund the New Deal, et cetera, they wanted to get rid of the power of the left and the power of the government and the power of the left in and on the government. And so there began a demonization. One part of that demonization, the first part and the major part, was an attack on the Communist Party. I don't want to discuss whether that was reasonable or not. This is not about agreeing or not agreeing with the Communist Party. But one thing one has to say is the following. The charge made against the Communist Party, on the basis of which some were deported out of this country, many were arrested, some were imprisoned with the Smith Act and so on back then. We even had a House Un-American Activities Committee driving people out of their jobs, out of their neighborhoods. We really did a full court press for about 15 years, and it has gone down in American history with the word McCarthyism of one of the senators who led the charge. The charge against the communists was this: that by being a communist, particularly a leader of the Communist Party or an active member, you were, by definition, here we go, advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government by force and violence. That was the charge. And on that basis, you were persecuted or prosecuted. Here's the irony of not knowing your history. The Communist Party never did the kind of thing we saw on January 6th. Nothing like it.
Right.
By the way, they organized demonstrations all over the place. Sure, they did. They organized voting. They organized but they never used force and violence on anything remotely like the scale that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the other ones that were doing their thing on the 6th of January. It is remarkable to me that what was done to them, who never did force and violence, is not even being contemplated at this point with a political movement that in fact demonstrated its willingness, its commitment, its celebration of using force and violence to overthrow the government. Only a society that wasn't aware of this history and of the glaring contradiction it implies and exposes could allow the impeachment conversation to continue in this history-blinded way without noticing the contradiction here. It kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, I have nothing I can possibly add to that, except that my parents were working at a communist day camp in 1946, and my dad was directing the musical numbers, and says Comrade Marshal Tito or whatever, and the directives would occasionally come down from the party: Tito's out. That was no more Tito. You can't Tito. But that, at least he knew who was giving him the instructions. In the brave new world of 2021, it's these faceless corporations on behalf of the people who control our economy speaking for us. And you're absolutely right. It's still tough to get certain points of view expressed in this political climate. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I think the issue is important, and it's not out of I do have an abstract commitment to freedom of speech. That's something I learned here in the United States growing up, and I'm happy about it. I feel good that it was stressed the way it was in my education. It's a good thing about the United States, but it is being, denied in practice, and I'm against that on grounds of principle. But I also want to stress, if you don't talk and let people talk, right wing, left wing, let them talk it out. If they advocate violent activity towards somebody else, of course, that's a threat that has to be taken seriously. Our laws are there for that. But to disallow conversation means you render our people less equipped with the history of their own development than they would be, and then we need them to be. If you don't let the history talk, it will repeat itself, and it's not as pretty the second time as it was the first. And if it was ugly the first time, it gets uglier if you don't know that it happened.
The oligarchical class preaches about the marketplace, but doesn't seem to believe in the marketplace of ideas, does it?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm sorry we don't have more time, but Richard Wolff, as always, an enormous pleasure to talk to you. As always, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ, for having a program to come on. I look forward to our next conversation.
As do I. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.